Well, we have left the season of Lent, and now we're in the season of the resurrection. But I have to be honest and admit that sometimes, as we celebrate Jesus' resurrection, I do wonder if anything has really changed. And I don't think I'm the only person who asked this question. The Capitals are out of the playoffs. The Nationals stink. DC politics is still crazy. Has anything changed because Jesus has been risen? Now, this is actually a serious question, because people still die. I just learned that our long-standing parishioner, John Cisneros, just died. People still mourn. We still battle emptiness and fear, and we can be filled with all kinds of doubts. And of course, we live in a world of violence and hate and death and injustice. So I ask myself, has anything really changed? Or are we still just at the mercy of the dark, hard forces that seem to dominate our world? It's a challenging question to ask yourself, but I have found, as I've read over chapter 20 of John's Gospel, a very powerful response to this question that I want to share with you this morning. And I encourage you, when you go home, open up chapter 20 of John and read it over. Just read it over multiple times. It's an extraordinary chapter. Just to remind you, it begins with Mary Magdalene at the garden tomb, weeping and grieving. And then it moves to the disciples in the upper room, and then a week later we see Thomas showing up. He was on vacation or something. Now, if you watch those three scenes, you will see something extraordinary about our faith and about what Jesus' resurrection means for us in our world. Mary stands by the tomb weeping, filled with grief, aching at the loss of her friend. And let's admit it, we've all known loss. We've all known death. We've all suffered in this way. And then the disciples, they're locked in that room, terrified that Pilate's soldiers will come next for them. And we've all known fear of all sorts. And then there's Thomas, who demands these certain kinds of constraints, trying to control reality. And if it isn't controlled this way, I'm not going to believe. And let's face it, we sometimes suffer from doubts about ourselves. Lord knows we have doubts about the church. Maybe even doubts about our faith. But all three, Mary, the disciples in the upper room, and Thomas, undergo a dramatic change in this chapter. And the question is, what changed them? What freed Mary from her grief so that she was filled with new life and a mission, the first of the apostles, to announce that Jesus has been raised? What freed the disciples from their fear so that they were filled with joy and set out to proclaim the good news? What transformed Thomas's doubt into belief? If you discover this, and if you begin to experience this in your life, you will discover how the resurrection of Jesus is changing everything. So I want you to try out a word. The word is presence. Say the word. Presence. Isn't it a wonderful word? Presence. We all know absence and loss and aching emptiness, but presence, it kind of washes over your body. When someone is present to you, there's a kind of richness and fullness about presence compared to the ache of absence. And then the other word I want you to try out is newness. Go ahead, say it. So, new presence. You know, when something is new, it's fresh, it's exciting, it's dynamic, it's unexpected. And Isaiah, the prophet, tells us that God says the following: "See, I am doing something new." But let me tell you, there is nothing more new than the presence of the risen Jesus. It is newness itself. His new presence to the disciples and to Mary and Thomas and us brings a new power and a new kind of life into history. It's a power that is greater than the hate and violence that killed him. You see, when Jesus is present, when his new presence is present to us, our lives are now filled with God's freeing and transformative love. You see, it was his being present to Mary and the disciples in the upper room and Thomas that changed everything. And notice, he was present while she was grieving. He was present while they were terrified. He was present even though Thomas doubted him. Boy, talk about good news. It means that the Lord is present to us when we are sad and sorrowful and aching. It means he's present there with us, accompanying us when we are scared and terrified and lost. It means even when we have doubts, he is still there, because he does not relate to us based on how we feel or think, but out of God's love. And because he's present to Mary and the disciples and Thomas, everything changes for them. You see, the new, fresh presence of the risen Jesus makes it possible to live in a new way, to respond in new ways, rather than the same old that our world expects from us. So my prayer this Easter is that each of you, all of us in this parish, discover in fresh new ways how much the risen Lord is present to you. If death cannot tie him down, then nothing can separate his presence from you. St. Paul in Romans 8, the end of Romans 8 says, there's nothing that separates from the love of God. And he gives this great list. Neither heights nor depths, nor powers or principalities, neither suffering nor death itself can separate us from the love of Jesus. That's why Paul says we are in Christ. Because of the resurrection, our very identities are changed. We are now not people who are identified as those who live in fear and sorrow and hate. We are people who live in the rich, new presence of the risen Jesus. So I pray you discover his presence in your friends, in those who care for you, in your families, in this community, in the word, in the sacrament, in our priest, and as you leave here and go about being people who do the work of Jesus. I was once giving a talk to a group of healthcare professionals, and I was talking, and they were all Catholic. It was a Catholic group, but I was talking to them about the resurrection. And this woman raised her hand and said to me, why does Jesus keep showing up? Why does he keep appearing? He appears in the upper room, he appears on the road to Emmaus, he appears up in Galilee. Like, isn't once enough? You think if a guy who was definitely dead all of a sudden appears to you fully alive with a body, that would be enough to convince you that he's real. So why does he keep showing up? It's a great question. And here's why. Because Jesus isn't just showing up to say to the disciples, I've been risen. Death is defeated. He is doing that. But he's doing something else. His appearing, his presence is the beginning of the creation of a new kind of culture and a new kind of community that we are invited to be part of. Did you notice when he appears, he still has the wounds? Isn't that kind of weird? You'd think if you're getting a risen body, if death couldn't hold you down, you'd at least gotten those healed. But he still has them. I think it's fascinating. I think this is why. Because the risen Jesus is appearing and is present in our world and our history because he's creating a new kind of culture that is focused and gives priority to the suffering and the crucified, not to the wealthy and powerful. And the church, this parish, we are people who are called to live out of that new kind of culture that doesn't focus on pharaohs and kings and emperors, on the lives of the rich and famous, but finds Jesus present in the suffering and in the crucified. This is a revolution in cultural consciousness that his presence introduces into the world and that we are called to live out of. Could you imagine if we started to make laws and policies and economic structures that put the suffering and the crucified first? It'd be a whole new world. And he's also present and keeps showing up here every time we gather because he's trying to create a new kind of community that doesn't live anymore out of fear and hate and death and loss and doubt, but lives out of the fullness, the richness of his presence, that lives out of the joy, the hope, the sense of freedom and new possibility that his presence gives. And that is us. That is who we are. So you guys got to get out of here and go tell everybody about this good news, because our hurting, hungry, and harmful world needs to hear it and needs to see it in how we live and respond and relate to others. Happy Easter, everybody.